Let's kick off this Independence Day with a boom.
Wait.
What?
You gotta do it with the good old India-made musket.
We're trading in the Pet Rizzoli for the military heritage. You got a point. It wouldn't feel like 4th of July without the military heritage long land pattern. This ought to be fun. Well, hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another episode of the 11 Bang Bang channel. I'm your host, Ethan Woods, and the flies are attacking us out here on this nice, warm July day. And welcome back to the channel. We've been down for a little while, but we're going to go ahead and do something that we kind of did with Thanksgiving. We're doing the Guns of the Pilgrims for Thanksgiving. Be sure to tune into that one in November, because I think we're going to have a pretty special gun if it ever gets shipped. But we kind of beat it to death. But we're going to do a brief history of the land pattern musket, or the Brown Bess. And we're not just going to do one, we're going to be doing two. So sit back, listen to the fireworks going off outside, have you a piece of that nice sweet cherry pie. Oh, that's pretty good. And just enjoy the show. So, just for those of you who already know, and I'm sure most of you do, we're going to be shooting some paper cartridges. That's what these guns shoot. Most people are of the misconception that these flintlocks were 100% useless because you had to sit there and you had to patch the round ball and you had to do all that. Not so much with military smoothbores. They were made to shoot these bad boys. And a good guy with one of these can shoot up to around 4 rounds a minute. Some maybe even higher. I've heard some big YouTube channels, and I won't mention any names, but some of you will know who I'm talking about, who got up there and made a statement about how they didn't see how anybody could fire one of these more than 3 rounds a minute, which I've done myself, and I'm no expert, so I'm just a souped up hillbilly. But anyhow, the way these work, and you'll notice we got two very distinct different kinds of paper cartridges here. We have some that are tied with paper, and some that don't have any string on them at all. And at first glance you might just be like, oh, that's just a tube with powder and a ball in it. Actually, there is a division in there that's made out of the paper itself. So there's a paper wall, if you would, in between the ball and the powder on these ones. And these are much more, I like these a lot better. These take a lot longer to make with the string. But anyhow, let me show you how these load. They both load the exact same way. Take your paper cartridge, go ahead and bite off the tail. Prime. Now, some people are probably going to be losing their minds if they see me priming before I load the gun. But that's how it was done historically. Close the hammer, cast about, pour powder charge, and drop the cartridge down the barrel. Get the rammer. Ram it home. 1, 2, 3. Now, is that the proper drill? Maybe not, but it works. So where do we start when we are talking about the history of the family of the land pattern musket, or as we refer to it now as the Brown Bess? And I think to do that we have to go to the dawn of the 18th century. That's right, I'm talking about 1700 to around 1715, around the time of the War of Spanish Succession. At this time, the British Board of Ordnance was getting their long arms from a whole lot of different places. They were getting them from places like Ireland, from England, and mainly from Holland, actually. And as long as these guns were kind of generally the same caliber and could meet the proofing expectations and requirements by the British Ordnance agents, they were generally accepted. The problem with this is there was no standardization. All these guns were different kinds of guns. They had absolutely no interchangeable parts. Some of them had different manual of arms to them. It was a bit of a mess. That was all until the year of 1715. The War of Spanish Succession is over, and Britain actually finds themselves in a very comfortable spot in the world stage, as it were, after this situation. And the British Board of Ordnance starts to revamp the long arm manufacturing facilities. Basically what they want to do is they want to streamline everything. They want to make more closer to interchangeable parts. They want guns to have the same caliber, the same manual of arms. They're wanting to adopt a standardized weapon. Now, does this mean that they stopped buying from all these other sources that I mentioned prior? Absolutely not. You know, sometimes money gets tight, and they will go and buy from these other sources occasionally, but they're really wanting to focus on standardization. So it's the start of the 18th century, as I mentioned beforehand, and of the next 100 years of this 18th century, Britain is going to be at war for 51 of them. A lot of people like to call this whole era the Second 100 Years' War. And so as this system that we have just talked about developed and operated from the year of 1720 roughly until well into the 19th century, the system was simply that officials designated by the Board of Ordnance signed contracts on behalf of the Ordnance for the supply of the various components required to set up a complete weapon. The size of the order would depend largely upon the amount of money available at the time and the requirements for bringing the number of weapons in store up to the predetermined figure. The contracts were separately negotiated with each of the several makers of parts concerned, although they tended to work together. Patterns would be furnished by the Ordnance to the makers of the parts, and the finished parts were delivered either to the Ordnance contractors or they would be directly delivered to the central depot in the Tower of London. So basically what you would have is a group of guys known as stockers or setter-ups that would work around the Tower of London, and these individuals would have the jobs of carving out stocks, fitting bayonets to barrels, things like this. This would go on clear up into the 19th century. So this just kind of sets the stage for how the Brown Bess would come to be. So let's start off by talking about the land pattern musket, or as we call it today, the long land pattern. Now this gun is actually a product of the pre-land pattern. And the pre-land pattern muskets, well, they were kind of still a conglomeration of the Dutch parts that we had talked about earlier. But they would go and eventually would evolve into the land pattern musket, especially in the 1720s, whenever you start to see the rise of brass furniture in Great Britain. And this is kind of what makes a Bess a Bess. You know, other guns like French guns, they generally have iron furniture, iron mountings, but Brown Besses are generally denoted by the brass furniture on them. You really don't see a sudden change from this pre-land pattern design into the government musket. The handrail or stair rail shape of the butt with the long narrow comb and round wrist extending back over half of the length of the butt, the quote banana lock plate unquote with the pronounced downward curve of the tail of the plate, the swell of the stock at the tailpipes to afford a better grip, the form of the stock carving around the barrel tang and around the lock plate and side plate flat, and the rounded swan neck cock with its jaws nearly rounded in shape. All of these features occurred increasingly on muskets made from the early 1720s. The double border lines engraved around the edges of the lock plate and the body and the top jaw of the cock appeared during the first 5 years of the period to become standard decoration by the late 1720s. and the dating of the locks changed from only the final two figures of the date on the earliest locks to the use of the full date by about 1725. Now, in the early 1740s, the first real change to the long land pattern occurred, which was widely applied to the long land pattern musket as a whole, was the adoption of the double-bridled lock. This consisted of a connection, or a link, between the pan and the steel screw, giving the latter much greater support. It is quite rare to find a lock dating later than 1745, which is of the older single bridle type, except on the sea service muskets. Another huge change in the development of the long land pattern musket was the adoption of an iron rammer. Yes, this was a huge improvement. The good thing about an iron rammer is A, it's not likely to break and impale your hand, and B, if the cartridge gets lodged in the barrel somehow, for instance, if you do as I do occasionally and accidentally fold the paper wrong, you can simply beat the cartridge down the barrel with that iron rammer. I'd say it's pretty deadly at this range. You know, the long land pattern, it's a pretty fun gun. Especially if you had a bayonet on the end of this, I wouldn't mind having that great big old long barrel for making a very good spear. However, it did have its downfalls, especially here in North America. It's long, and if you couldn't tell, even when we were down there just messing around, you go to level this thing and you hit tree branches and everything else. And the British Army did realize that this was going to be a problem. And so they came up with something a little bit different. Let me introduce to you the shortland pattern. Get that flipped around there. This is the Pedersoli one. And let's just look at a few of the differences between these two. Namely, we're a little bit shorter. The biggest drawback of the long land pattern was its length. The gun had an overall length of 62.5 inches. It had a 46-inch long barrel. It held a 17-inch long bayonet. But there is a fix for this problem. You see, in the 1740s, the dragoons, which you've heard me talk about before on the dragoon pistol video, had their own weapon that was basically an improvement over their pistols, which was a dragoon carbine. This gun was basically a cut-down land pattern musket, and in the 1740s it even still incorporated the wooden rammer. However, it was soon seen that this handy little carbine could be used very effectively in the hands of the infantry. That would really not take place until it was officially sanctioned as an infantry musket by the Royal Warrant of 11th of June of 1768. Now in 1768, the 42-inch barrel would become standard, but this was only on paper, and you should not confuse this with any consideration of the weapon in the hands of the troops at a given date from, say, circa 1770. There was a hodgepodge of long and short hand pattern muskets in issue. So in 1770, the shortland pattern Brown Bess got one of its last upgrades in the shape of the steel rammer. This was also the year that the dragoons lost the shortland pattern and it was replaced by the Elliott carbine. And this is the shortland pattern that we all know and love today. There would be another small change that would take place on paper from 1777, and that would be what is known as Pratt's funnel-shaped second ramrod pipe. Now we've talked about the development and the differences of these guns, let's finally get into the meat and taters, as it were, of their usage on the battlefield in the American Revolutionary War. Let's start out with this long land pattern. These would have been sent over to the colonies all throughout the time of their manufacture. And many of these would be captured early on in the war by American rebels, and these would be used extensively throughout the war. But that's not to say that they were only used by the American rebels, they were also used by the British Grenadiers. See, that long musket is not very wieldy for your average infantryman. However, Grenadiers were specifically picked due to their size, their strength, and this was because early on in the Grenadier's profession, the job of the Grenadier was to throw hand grenades. Now, before anybody jumps my case about this, yes, I know idea of the hand grenade started going by the wayside, definitely before the American Revolutionary War and before the 7 Years' War or the French and Indian War. However, this tradition stayed in place, and they were usually used kind of as a troop that you would put over on your flanks. These men could handle that length of that long land pattern much better than your average infantryman. Not only that, it also gave them an advantage whenever it came to bayonet fighting, because 4 inches of extra barrel length doesn't sound like a lot, but whenever it comes to getting in basically a spear fight, that's plenty. Now let's talk about the short land pattern. These would be predominantly used by the British soldiers. The reason why is it is a new weapon. Now, it was not uncommon to see American soldiers carrying these weapons, but it was a lot less common than, say, something like a Charleville. Now, there are a lot of myths whenever it comes to the Brown Bess, either the long or the land pattern, really just any smoothbore musket in general, and I'd like to address a few of those right here. I need to do a whole video on this sometime, but for now this will have to suffice. One of my favorites is that the guns were so inaccurate that you couldn't hit anything past 50 yards, and that the soldiers were specifically told to not aim at the enemy line, just to point the gun in their general direction and pull the trigger and reload and shoot as fast as you could. There's some truth to that. They weren't trained to aim at individual targets as line infantry. They were trained to aim at the enemy line. How do we know this? Well, because there were some tests that were actually done on this subject. The British Board of Ordnance had actually done some tests, and they found that the maximum effective range of the Brown Bess was 150 yards, just kind of like I had discovered myself. What they had found was that at 100 yards with roughly trained line infantry soldiers, they could expect approximately about 53% of the round balls would hit the enemy line. 150 yards, they whittled that down to about 42%, and they went all the way out to 300 yards where they actually still were getting 23% hits with illy trained troops. That's actually kind of impressive. So no, it was not a Patriot moment as much as I actually like the movie Patriot. They did not look away and pull the trigger. Another reason we know this is because the guns are equipped with a sight. Now, I have been guilty of this myself early on in my flintlock shooting days. And I would say that that thing on the end that holds the bayonet on is strictly a bayonet lug and was not used for aiming. This is actually wrong. And the reason we know this is because there are some documents that actually call it a sight. For instance, a plan of discipline composed for the use of the militia of the county of Norfolk has this diagram right here, which specifically calls that little nubbin on the end of the barrel a sight. They were actually supposed to aim with these guns. And big shout out to Chris the Redcoat for doing a video on that subject. That was what opened my eyes to that little bit of truth. But yeah, the guns were designed to at least aim at an enemy line. Now, they could also be used in light infantry tactics and used for skirmishing. How do we know this? Well, because the British later on in the war, especially during the Southern Campaign, they would actually send out a soldier with a pattern 1776 rifle, which, spoiler alert, hopefully that will be next Independence Day's video, is the history of the pattern 1776. I've got one coming from the rifle shop I've got to build. But they would deploy a soldier with a pattern 1776 and a soldier to cover him with a short land pattern musket. And that guy with the short land pattern musket was expected to hit targets. Well, unfortunately, the short land pattern just couldn't last forever. And come the 1790s, it would eventually get replaced by what is now known as the India pattern musket. Namely for the fact that the India pattern musket was just so much cheaper to produce, and another huge war was boiling up over the horizon. But you know what? That's a story for another day. Well, guys, that's about all I got for you today. So as always, thank you for watching. Trust in God.